For this month of May, if you do not know, or maybe it's your first time here, we're doing a series called ALLELON, and it focuses on building a Christ-centered community. And so what exactly does ALLELON mean? Okay, so it's a Greek word which means one another. And it really focuses on how Christians in our community here in church should relate with one another. So the question is, okay, we have this new series, but why so important, right? We can't just have a new series and we're going to be talking about ALLELON for the next few Sundays, but we don't know why we're talking about it. So here are three summarized reasons as to why it's so important for us to ALLELON or to one another or do life together. Firstly, it fulfills Jesus' command. And what was Jesus' command? If you were here last Sunday, our beautiful Ate Nina kick-started our series with loving one another. And Jesus' command was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and also love one another in your community as Christ has loved us, right? Second is for us to experience God's community and experience God's love through our community. And third, it facilitates our maturity and growth into Christ-likeness, because our ultimate goal as Christ followers is to be like Christ, right? Yeah, so here's a fun overview, the one another's that we're talking about in this month of May. And as I've shared, Ate Nina has beautifully laid out for us the importance of loving one another, which is ultimately the foundation of all the one another's. Without love as our foundation, there's no point in doing the rest of the one another's here. And if you came for morning service, our AM service, our beautiful Ate Jazz, she shared on being humble to one another. And for the third installment, your amazing Nicole, Lavinia, will be talking about spurring one another. And please come for the next 2 Sundays left in our month of May, because we'll have 4 different and also all beautiful speakers who will be talking about forgiving, accepting, admonishing, and bearing each other's burdens. So now let's get into our message. Or before we get into it, let me set the tone with this one question I'd like to ask all of you today. So when was the last time you had a difficult conversation with someone? Do we usually have difficult conversations with one another as our go-to, as our starters? No, right? Usually it's kamustahan. Hey, how are you? What's the new chismis, right? It's not a thing that we meet one another just to have difficult conversations with one another, right? I'd like you to think of this question throughout our message for today, okay? And if I could entitle our conversation today, it would be a sensitive topic. And why? I've entitled it a sensitive topic because for my topic, spurring one another, it is not something that we would usually do, okay? And we'll get into that in the next few slides as we go through it. And our conversation will be in Ephesians 4-5. So I keep saying spur one another, okay, but where do we get this in the Bible? We actually find our spurring one another verse in Hebrews 10:24-25. And it says here, "Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds." The one thing that encompasses our series this month, not giving up meeting together. Meeting with your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. Who here usually uses an excuse, oh, I'm an introvert, I don't really like to hang out. I think it's cooler na, I'll stay at home na lang by myself. No, we can't use this as an excuse. You should not be giving up meeting one another, as some are in the habit of doing, but continue to encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. If you look at the whole passage, there are two one another's mentioned. There is spur, and there's also encourage. So let's define first spur and encourage, because maybe for English speakers, you'll think, actually, spur and encourage, they're quite synonymous naman. They can be used in the same context, in the same way. But if you think about it, they're actually different. So let me show you an illustration. Do you know what this is? It is a spur. It is a spur. Okay, it's actually a spur. The noun spur is a spiked wheel at the back of a cowboy's boot. At the back of a cowboy's boot. And the function of a spur is actually to urge a horse to move forward. So you know when cowboys ride their horse, if their horse is a little slow and they want to go faster, they'll just kick the horse on its side to urge it to move forward. And I always wondered, like, okay, I thought that, I didn't think that this spiked wheel had any use in a cowboy's boot. I honestly thought that it was some magical way for them to skate. I don't know why, but apparently that's what it's for. It was used to hit the sides of the horse to urge them to move forward. And I think you can imagine the feeling of a horse. If someone is poking you on the side with something sharp, it's not a nice feeling. Now let's compare spurring and encouraging side by side. So you see this guy, okay, he's not wearing cowboy boots. Pero think of the stick as the spur. So you see the spur is being used to poke the back of the donkey to urge it to move forward. But for the carrot, what does it do? The carrot is placed in front of the donkey to what? To kind of motivate it, to get it to, oh, I'm being enticed, I kind of want to eat that carrot. So the donkey wants to move forward to be able to eat the carrot. But for spurring, what is the feeling that the donkey feels? Oh, this is irritating. This is, I'm feeling a little provocation in my butt. I don't like that feeling. And because I don't like the feeling, I want to get out of that situation. So I'm going to move forward for the donkey, right? So maybe now you kind of see the difference between spur and encourage. For spur, you have a negative connotation that surrounds this word, where you think, oh, it's something that irritates me, something that stirs me up. I'm being provoked. I'm being challenged. But for encouragement, or for encourage, you think of positive words. You think of kind words. You think, wow, malaman naman ng puso ko. It feels so nice, all the things that you're saying to me, because that's what we think of when we say, let's encourage one another, right? So now that we've established an understanding that there's a difference between spur and encourage, we look back here in Hebrews 10, 24, 25, and see Paul saying, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. See, there's a specific reason now why you think, why Paul has used the word spur instead of encourage. Because sometimes encouraging or being nice, too nice, might not be good enough or might not work for some people in order for us to change for the better. Sometimes we need to provoke, sometimes we need to stir up the people around us and provoke and challenge them in order for them to step out of a situation that we know is not good for them, and for them to take a step forward into being someone better. And so if there is one thing I would like all of us to take away today, it would be this. It's that spurring leads to forward transformation. And so, now that we've got all that and the background of our spurring one another, let's go into the text where we can see an example in the Bible, right, that shows how spurring one another actually looks like. So as I've said, we'll be talking about Ephesians 4 to 5, if you can open your Bibles as well. Let me give you a little context, background, on Ephesians. So the letter of Ephesians is actually a letter to the church Ephesus, and because it's the second largest city, you'd expect, oh, there must be a lot of things going around. It's a bustling city. There are also many different types of people. Just like Singapore, there's not only one race. It's not just Romans who reside in Ephesus. There are also Jews, there are also Greeks, and many others that come from all over the place. And so, thinking about that, how do you think the situation is like for the Ephesus church? Do you think that their church is just made up of Jews? No, right? You'd think, oh, maybe they're made up of some Jews and probably mostly Gentiles, like Greeks and Romans and other ethnic groups in their church. And so, why did Paul feel the need to write a letter to this small church in Ephesus? So here, I'll give you like some context as to why Paul had to write it. So Paul, knowing the situation and the environment that the Ephesus church is in, he felt the need to write them a letter because they're so vulnerable to their surroundings, because of the way that the city is full of Gentiles and full of different ethnic groups, different religions, different cultural backgrounds. They're very vulnerable to being influenced by all these other societies and ethnic groups that also stay in Ephesus. And so Paul wants to encourage this small church in Ephesus to maintain unity within their church. So stay united, stay true to your faith, and maintain in your one purpose together, and also to resist temptation. In this area, the main religion, I'd say, that is being practiced is paganism. So a lot of these non-believers would practice worshiping different pagan idols for whatever reason. And so Paul is telling them, don't fall for their tricks, don't do what they do, stay true to your faith, and stay united within your church so that all of you are of the same mind and doing the same thing. So let's dive deep into our passage. In Ephesians 4:17, it says here by Paul, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking." Now, the word futility actually, as an easier word, it means pointlessness or uselessness of their thinking. And so it might be confusing here that Paul is like saying, you must no longer live as the Gentiles do. But the thing is, the Ephesus church is almost maybe more than 50% made up of Gentiles, right? So it's like, Paul, are you telling me, I'm confused, right? They must be confused as well. So let's clear that up. That Paul, when he says, you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, he's talking about non-believing Gentiles that live in their area or near the church. And when Paul says this, he uses Gentiles because he wants to establish for the believers that the way they live life is no longer as a Gentile. The way that they conduct themselves is the way that God's chosen people should conduct themselves. And hence why he's like, you are no longer a Gentile. You are God's chosen people. Which is back then, everyone was like, oh, Jews are just the chosen people. Yeah, but that is what Paul is trying to say. So don't get it confused, because these Gentiles mentioned in this verse refers to non-believing Gentiles. So what does Paul go on to say about this life that they shouldn't be living? Paul elaborates and continues on and says, they, referring to the non-believing Gentiles, they are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Wow, that's a lot of things that Paul has said, and none of it is a good thing. Now, so you can imagine, how is Paul spurring on the Ephesus church right now? Is it in a very nice way? Is he saying, you can do better? No, he's really stating bluntly the way that Gentiles live their life. And I can imagine if you were one of the believing Gentiles in the Ephesus church, you'd be hit by whatever Paul is saying, because you used to be a non-believer too. You used to live the way that these Gentiles used to live too, because you did not know Christ until Paul came to Ephesus, right? And here, you see Paul uses the word hardening. And so what does it mean when he says hardening of their hearts? So actually, the Greek word of hardening is parosis. It is one word, but in English, it can mean many, many things. And my favorite thing that it translates into is the obtuseness of mental discernment. Basically, what Paul is saying in this verse is that their understanding is so darkened and their life is so separated from God because of the hardening of their hearts, they have no mental discernment, and basically they're almost just living life for their own pleasures. They're so, for lack of a better word, they're so dumb. They're just living life like a bunch of robots with no thinking, just whatever feels nice, I will move towards what feels good. That's basically what Paul is saying about these non-believers. He goes to say, having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. Wow, back to back, Paul is just calling out these non-believing Gentiles. First, he called them people with hard hearts. And second, he says that these people don't care about anything, that they've fully given themselves to sensuality. And what does sensuality means? This is like a Greek lesson for you guys. For another fun fact, sensuality in the Greek word, in the Greek version, right, it's actually as elgaia. And when we translate it back to English, it means unbridled lust, or what I like also is the absence of all moral restraint. So when we look back here, he's saying they are living a life where they have no moral lines or no stop lines or walls built up to help them stop from going overboard. They're so willing to enjoy all pleasures of life that they don't care. They have no shame. They'll just do whatever feels good. Like really just a bunch of robots looking for pleasure. Their eyes are closed. Just, I want to feel good. I'm going to go here if it makes me feel good. It's a very anti-ALLELON way of thinking. Okay, I've put here, summarized, the way these non-believers are described. And for Paul, he's stressing this so much, he had to describe it in such detail because he must have known that these are the things, these sins, for example, indulging in all impurities, are the kinds of sins that the Christians or the believing Gentiles are exposed to in their area. And so he's telling them, hey, watch out. You used to be like that. Are you going to fall back into that kind of sin? No. And what's so great about this is no one becomes a great sinner all at once. And so what I mean by this is, think of these non-believing Gentiles. How come they've reached a point in their lives where it's so easy for them to do all these bad things without feeling any kind of guilt, any kind of shame? Because maybe one day, like at first, at the start, when they were young, committing a sin was a big deal. Doing one thing wrong makes them feel guilt, remorse, and regret. And immediately they think, what is a way that I can make up for the sin that I've done? How can I ask for forgiveness? But if they've reached the point where it's so easy to commit all the sins and it's become a norm to them, it's because they've probably done it over and over and over so much that their life has become so far away from God and their hearts have become so hard that there's nothing left for them to feel. All they can do is to feel good for themselves. There's this super cool thing I learned while I was preparing for my preaching, and it's called the 2-day rule. Maybe we, brothers and sisters, can apply it as well, especially if you're struggling with a certain sin, or you feel like it's so easy for me to still fall into the same sin. There's this thing called the 2-day rule where whenever you fall into maybe that one sin that is so easy for you to fall into, don't bring it on to the next day. Oh, okay, I've fallen here one day. And don't make an excuse like, because I've already done it, let me just do it again the next day. Oh, and I've done it for 2 days, let me just do it again the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day. Until you reach a point where you don't even make an excuse anymore. It's part of your routine. You're like, oh, okay, it's time for me to do this now. We don't want to reach that point, brothers and sisters, right? We don't want to reach a point where we don't even feel any guilt for the sins that we are committing. So when you fall, stop not there. That first time, that time that you've fallen, let it be the last of that time. So now let's go back into our passage. After Paul has graciously called out the non-believing Gentiles and their characteristics and the way that they live life, he goes on to say that that way of life, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. What is the truth that they were taught when they learned about who Jesus was and what Jesus has done for them on the cross? So Paul goes on to elaborate. You, talking to the Ephesus church, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. Okay, so let's pause here. I like how Paul, instead of going straight into what were they taught in Jesus and what were they taught when they learned about who Jesus was, he first reminded them, think about your former life with regard to your former way of life. Put off your old self. He's like, hey, remember, you used to do this. Everything I stated back just a few verses ago, all of you used to be full of greed. You're all selfish. And the way that the Gentiles live, that's how you used to live. Now think about that. And you used to wear that as like your clothes. That was your identity. Being a Gentile used to be your identity. But you were taught to put off your old self. Like clothes, I like how Paul describes it like it's clothes. You used to wear one thing, but now you don't wear that anymore. You took it off because that was your old life. And your old life was corrupted by its deceitful desires. And what were they taught? What is that new thing that they were taught in Jesus Christ? They were taught to be made new in the attitude of their minds and to put on the new self created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So here you see Paul is like kind of saloing them because the first few verses he was really hitting them hard and straightforward. He was saying this, and then they must have been feeling ouch, ouch, ouch. All you're saying is such negative things. It's like digging up all their dirty laundry for them to see it again. And now Paul is here saying, yeah, think about that, what I just said. Is that how you live life? Are you still wearing those clothes? No, because you were taught to put it off and put on the new self. And what is that new self? The new self is to be living life in true righteousness and holiness. And now, it is not the first time we've heard of this, take off your old self and put on your old self, right? And the thing is, what was God's original intention? It's like an echo back in Genesis. What was God's original intention for humanity when he created us? So God, when he created living creatures on land and in the water, he, our God, thought, who's going to rule over all these living creatures? I'm going to make humans, a being that is in my image, who looks like me, who's supposed to act like me, and these beings are supposed to rule over all the living creatures on land and in the water. And so, we were originally made in God's image. And until now, we're still made in God's image. Here you see in Genesis 1:26-27, it says that God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. When he's saying our, he's referring to God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So God created mankind in his own image, and in the image of God, he created them, male and female. And so, you see, Paul is saying here, your old life, which has been corrupted ever since the fall of humanity at the very start, it has been corrupted. And now you're wearing these clothes like Adam and Eve when they come to the knowledge of good and evil, they've covered themselves up with these clothes that are corrupted by our own desires, our own fleshly desires. And we're not supposed to be wearing those clothes anymore. We're supposed to put them off and put on the new clothes, which is to live life in true righteousness and in holiness. And you know the thing about wearing clothes, you never go out wearing two shirts at once, right? You don't wear, you're never gonna be, I can't decide, so I'm gonna wear one side, one hole. Then the other side, another hole. Then you see two shirts just hanging off of you. Nobody wears shirts like that. You always decide, am I gonna wear blue? Am I gonna wear pink? Pick one, right? And so think of that. When Paul says, put off your old self, he's reminding them, you can't just take off one sleeve and decide, okay, I'm gonna wear my new life halfway. No, you have to fully remove it. You cannot have even an inkling of your old self in you and live in your new self, in your new life found in Christ. And just like sitting on a fence, it's just like that. You can't be sitting on the fence deciding, do I want to stay in my old life, but it's so good. It's so fun. Are you going to sit on the fence just, I don't know, maybe I want to, sometimes I want to do this again, but then I still, love Jesus. I still love God. I'll still serve, but then sometimes I'll go back. So let me just sit on the fence so I can have the best of both worlds. No. Brothers and sisters, you have to pick a side because that fence is always on the bad side. Okay? So when the time when Jesus comes, are you still going to be sitting on the fence? No, you have to choose. Are you going to be on the side where Jesus is, or are you going to be on the side where he's not? Paul goes on to say then, and this part is quite nice. He doesn't only spur with such, bring out all the dirty laundry. He encourages then. He goes on to say, so follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. And I love this because it's like also, remember if you were here last Sunday, Ate Nina, who shared about loving one another, here Paul is echoing the same thing. Walk in the way of love just as Christ loved us. So it's so beautiful, his practical way of telling them, this is how you're going to do it. If you don't know how to do it, walk in the way of love. Okay? And it's so nice that I wanted to point out why Paul had to say love, because love is the foundation of everything that we do. If we do not have love, then what are we doing, right? If we do not do everything that we're doing with one another with love, then there's no point in spurring, in being humble, in forgiving, in admonishing, in bearing each other's burdens. There's no point in ALLELON at all if it is not because of love. It's nice to see that from the start of our passage, Paul reminds the people that, hey, this is the life that you used to live, or maybe even currently still struggling with and living in, but this is the way that you should be living in. And you see that there's a change from how they used to live and from how they are supposed to live as Paul spurs them on. There's only one way. It's not a backwards movement, it's only forward. And that's why spurring leads to forward transformation. Because, think about it, back at the start when I defined what spurring is, you never see a spur in front. Where was the donkey and the horse being spurred? From the behind, right? Because the goal is always to move forward and never to walk back. So Paul goes on to say, it's like a roller coaster. He was saying something very straightforward, and then he goes on to say, walk in the way of love. And then now he goes back again, but among you, there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Now, why do you think Paul felt the need to repeat what he said. In the earlier verses, I mentioned that the Gentiles live the life giving themselves over to sensuality. And here he repeats it again. There must not be a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Maybe it's because the Ephesus church, the number one sin or temptation that they're struggling with is sexual sin or being impure. So that's why Paul felt the need, I'm going to repeat it one more time. Even if it hurts, or maybe just so that it hurts, let me say it again so that you know this is not the proper way for God's holy people. And he goes on to say, for this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. He really was here saying, let me remind you again, if you are still committing these sins, being immoral, being impure, being greedy, you're idolizing these sins instead of focusing your eyes on God. And because you're idolizing these things and you're still doing these sins, you have no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Ouch! Can you imagine? You just converted, you've just fully changed your life, and you just found out about the gospel, and you want to live a better life, but you're struggling with this certain sin. And Paul here gives you a letter and tells you, hey, by the way, you're still doing those sins, right? There's no inheritance for you in the kingdom of God. Can you imagine how that must have felt? It's like, that's so painful. He's really out here being as blunt and as straightforward as possible. And that's how you see the spurring happening. And so he ends it with another encouragement. So be careful, okay? Be careful of the way that you live. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. And therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. So looking at the overarching message of our whole Ephesians story, you can see how Paul has spurred on the Ephesus church. It must have hurt them at certain points when he was calling out and laying out all their dirty laundry, all the things that they used to do or maybe are still doing. But he comes in and also encourages once in a while, because you can't always be mean, right? You can't always keep poking a person. But sometimes poking is also good, because that irritation, that challenging that the people feel helps them to move forward. So what about us, brothers and sisters? What about us? Are we brave enough, just like Paul, to spur one another on, even when it's difficult? Okay, let me say, it's not easy to call out someone for their mistakes or for the things that they are doing that you know are wrong. It's not easy. But Paul also knows it's not easy. He's human too. But you see here, he took courage. He was brave enough to call them out, because the only reason why he want to do it, he want to call them out, is he wants them to be better. He wants them to live the life that is pleasing in God's sight. So if I could challenge us naman, for us, let us also, like Paul, take courage to spur one another on. But how exactly do we do that? Okay. Yes, we've gone through the whole Ephesians, and we've seen the example of how spurring one another looks like. But how do we do it as one-to-one? Okay, because here you see Paul is spurring on the entire church, and it's through a letter. But for us, it's through conversation. We're actually talking with one another. So bring it to light. Don't be afraid to say these things. And the great thing about it is that, the thing about ALLELON is that when we're in such a close proximity, we will rub shoulders once in a while. And sometimes it's good to have this feeling of like tension with one another, especially when that tension arises because of the conversations that we have, because we spur one another. And it's not easy, okay? So bring it to light, call it out, and be open to difficult conversations. Sometimes we need to step out of fear and say what hurts when it needs to be said. So, if you remember the very first question that I asked you guys, when was the last time you had a difficult conversation with someone? In light of our message, is there someone in your head that you're thinking about that I feel God is urging me to talk with this person? Because, or maybe there's a close friend of yours that, you've been living life together, you've been doing life together, you've been ALLELONing. And so, because of that, you see what situation they're in, what struggles they're facing, and you feel like, I know this person can do so much better. I know that this person can take a step forward. But are we having these conversations with these people? So let's take courage to spur. And if I could answer this question, I myself have recently had a difficult conversation with someone. And let me say, it's not easy. Like, it's so easy to think about doing it. But when you're actually in the moment, and when you actually feel the urge from the Holy Spirit to talk with this person that you're thinking about, it's really hard. So I know it's hard because for me, when I was thinking about talking with this person, I had to approach many people. I had to ask for advice, like, how am I going to do this? Like, I feel like God is calling me to talk with this person. I really want to talk to this person because I know this person can be in a better situation that they're in. How? Help me, right? And so finally, one day, I finally did it, and I took the time to talk to this person, and it was really uncomfortable. It was very difficult. And difficult for me to say the hurtful things that I needed to say with love to this person as she or he received this message, received my words. But after that whole ordeal of, being very uncomfortable, feeling like, I might break this friendship because of what I'm saying, that person finally decided to change their life. I suddenly see the next few Sundays, hey, Nicole, I need to share with you something. God has spoken to me. Finally, after what you said, I want to change my life. I'm not going to do this anymore. I want to stop doing this. And to me, like, when I finally was able to see that change in that person, it was so nice. Now, you see, just because of that fear, it took longer for me to talk with this person than I could have. I could have helped this person change earlier, although that person still had a change in their life. Do you see the effect? If you just take a step forward, take courage, be brave enough to, I'm going to just do it. I'm going to spur this friend on. I'm going to spur this loved one on. Because your intention is love and your intention is to help them be better, then it's always going to work out because spurring leads to forward transformation, never backward. If it goes backward, then that's something that you're doing that is wrong. The way that you approach is you think it's coming from pride na. It's coming, I'm better than this person. So I'm going to tell this person, hey, you like to do a lot of wrong things. You're doing this. But nobody is perfect, right? So humble yourselves and think that the only reason why you want to spur one another on is because you want better for yourself, for that person, and for everyone that's around you. Let's reflect on the message today, this afternoon, on how we can spur one another on to be better, toward love, toward good deeds, and toward being more like Christ. Because ultimately, when we spur one another into being like Christ, everything else follows. Love, being good, everything will just cascade down.